Sam.
Hello, sir.
What do you know about general strikes?
I know that they tend to get in the way.
That's really the point. Hello and welcome to Revolutions of Our Time, the podcast about protests, revolutions, where we try and see what lessons we can tease out to keep fighting the good fight. My name's Adam, and with me, as always, is Sam, a man sat there in California raging against the youth who are complaining about the work he's doing. How are you doing today, Sam?
It's a thankless job working in higher ed, but dems to breaks.
Dems to breaks, indeed. So we have an episode today about general strikes, as the intro suggested, but a couple of little housekeeping bits. The first, we have a Independence Day of the month, or of the session of the week to celebrate.
We just have an Independence Day to celebrate.
We have an Independence Day to celebrate. We talked about moving this to the end, but we've got some other housekeeping, so it's included now. The year of independence is 1991, so can you guess who it is independence from?
From the Soviet Union, I'm guessing.
Absolutely correct. The 27th of September is celebrated in Turkmenistan as the Turkmen Independence Day from the Soviet Union, which happened on the 27th of October 1991. Now, the Independence Day is celebrated on the 27th of September because in 2018, the Turkmeni government decided to move the date back by 1 month.
Is it because it's the dictator's birthday?
It's not clear. This was the last thing I looked up before this episode, and I didn't really have time to find in, but I did have a little look around, and no one seemed to be aware. All the articles I could find about changing the dates were about changing it back from the days of the week named after all the dictators' favorite people.
Well, this is the country where all of the cars are white, because that's what the dictator prefers, right?
It's true. It's also home to the world's largest indoor Ferris wheel.
And the longest burning gas crater or something like that.
Oh, yeah, the door to hell. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of notable stuff out there.
A lot of notable stuff. Turkmenistan sounds lit. The independence from the Soviet Union followed a vote in March of that year, which actually tried to save the Soviet Union by creating a new entity called the Union of Sovereign States. But that didn't last. It fell apart. People wanted to remain in the Soviet Union, but it kind of became apparent that wasn't to happen. And so independence was formally declared on the 27th of October, yet now celebrated on the 27th of September. So congratulations, I guess, to Turkmenistan.
Yeah, are they really independent? I guess they're independent in the same way like North Koreans are independent.
I suppose so. Also, the Soviet Union does no longer exist, so I don't know the degree to which we can conflate it with modern Russia.
Happy breakup day.
Happy breakup day. Happy breakup party day. Also wanted to mention some sadder news that we received in the past couple of days. If you are a listener of this podcast, first of all, thank you. And you may be familiar from episode 9, we interviewed Ike Ndolo, a Catholic musician, a man of faith who found himself ostracized in the American church for his views on Palestine, who has recently lost his job because of those views. As far as we're aware, it's not because of his podcast appearance. We don't think we have that kind of power, but our condolences to Ike and wishing you all the best going forward.
From what I know, from speaking to him briefly in the past few days, is that he's been receiving a lot of support, but this was clearly due to his outspoken views about Palestine. And I think it might come in relation to timing with free speech being cracked down on due to the murder of Charlie Kirk. There's been a lot of dominoes, Ike's job being one of them, but Ike did also say he feels very liberated in a way. So maybe that's the Independence Day to celebrate. That Ike can go on to bigger and better things for himself. Because as we know, he's a smart guy, he's a talented guy, so we wish him the best of luck, and maybe he'll be back on one day. Who knows?
Yeah, happy Independence Day to Ike Ndolo. Now, Sam, today we are going to be talking about general strikes. Why are we going to be talking about general strikes? I set it up like a rhetorical question, but I do want to know from you.
Based on my experience, general strikes seem to be one of the few protest methods that work consistently.
Mm-hmm.
they really do disrupt. They really do get in the way. And from what I know from my experience in Hong Kong and seeing other strikes abroad, they're very hard to organize and agree to do. So that's why they're rarer. But when they do happen, they're very, very disruptive and usually get the job done. It's kind of a nuclear option for the working class.
Yeah, and they've kind of been in the news recently because of action in Italy over the Sumud Flotilla, and Italy agreeing to send a warship to sort of watch over the flotilla in response in part to the general strikes. But I want to build up to that because we're sort of in the middle of the industrial strike action in Italy and the role of the Navy with the Sumud Flotilla. But I want to talk about some previous general strikes first that led to lasting consequences. One in Czechoslovakia in 1989, one in India in 2020, and then the Italian strike that is sort of ongoing. Now, have you heard of the Velvet Revolution?
I don't know it in detail, but I do know that Czechoslovakia did see a lot of unrest in the mid-20th century, towards the late 20th century as well, because they were under the Iron Curtain. So they were under the USSR sphere of influence, but they weren't part of the Soviet Union. So they were really pressed up against the border with the West, with a lot of their population sort of wanting to be more under Western influence, but the Soviets really not wanting that to happen. So I know that the Velvet Revolution and protests in Czechoslovakia were a result of that.
So you're absolutely right in what you're saying, and the sort of relationship that Czechoslovakia had to the Soviets and to the Western Bloc as well. But the Velvet Revolution itself actually refers specifically to the split up of Czechia and Slovakia.
Oh, okay.
It's sometimes called the Velvet Divorce.
Right.
Because it was just a very smooth transition. And it was in part facilitated by a general strike. But I think actually what you were talking about gives excellent context for why that happened. Czechoslovakia was indeed a sort of Soviet satellite state, and throughout the earlier part of the 20th century hadn't seen a lot of the sort of industrial benefits that places like Turkmenistan had seen, because Czechoslovakia was industrialized prior to World War II. So they didn't really benefit from rapid industrialization because they were already basically industrialized.
Right. And had this region been an independent state in the modern era previously? Because I know it was sort of always historically under the rule of others. Like even when they were the Kingdom of Bohemia, they were under the Holy Roman Empire, and then the land kind of was fought over by different people.
Yeah, not really. There were various historical kingdoms. There were ethnic Czechs and ethnic Slovaks who lived in the region, and as you say, as part of various kingdoms. So the Kingdom of Bohemia, as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as part of Germany, most famously during the early days of the Second World War, Hitler annexed a part of Czechoslovakia in order to give Lebensraum. So sort of there were nationalist movements around Czechs and Slovaks. The degree to which Czechs and Slovaks were ethnically different people is still a little bit a matter for debate.
Okay.
Czech and Slovak are mutually intelligible languages, although it seems Slovaks can understand Czech a lot more easily than Czechs can understand Slovaks, but they can have a conversation in their own languages without too much difficulty. I have two friends called Barbara, one from Czechia, one from Slovakia, and they're friends with each other, and they just chat away in Czech and Slovak, respectively.
Okay.
In part because of the fact that Czechia wasn't receiving a lot of benefit from being in the Soviet Union, and because censorship was so strong in the country, there was a real sense of discontent in Czechia that led to the Prague Spring in the 1960s, which is maybe what you were referring to
that was
just now. Do you remember much about that?
So I think that is what I was referring to there, discontent against communist influence.
Yeah.
So to the listeners, I don't know everything about history. But yeah, and I think it's interesting that a little fun fact is the last time Adam and I were in the same place, it was in Prague, and you can see a lot of remnants of the discontent, whether that be the Lenin Wall.
That's Lenin as in John Lennon, not Vladimir Lenin.
Yeah. And I like to go look in bookstores, old bookstores, especially in old cities, and Adam does as well. So we found ourselves popping into various places. And it was really funny how some were either really pro-communist or really anti-communist still. Yeah. There's still that clash in the city, but lovely place.
Yeah, it's lovely. And so you mentioned the Lenin Wall, and that's a great example of something that is a remnant for this time, because the Prague Spring happened partly as a result of this political reformer, a guy called Alexander Dubček, and he was a politician and basically proposed some reforms in Czechoslovakia. They didn't want to abandon communism, but they wanted to move to a more sort of mixed economy, do trade with the Soviets and the West, and really loosen censorship laws, right? And so they, as part of this Prague Spring, they invited in a lot of Western art and music and media, hence the wall commemorating John Lennon that does still remain in Prague, opposite the French embassy. This was deemed unacceptable by the Soviets.
They sent in tanks, right?
They did. They sent an invasion force along with 5 other Warsaw Pact countries. 500 people were killed. Tanks rolled into Prague. And the geopolitical reasons are interesting, but not super relevant. It was basically that for Brezhnev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, and indeed the leaders before then, Czechoslovakia was like strategically important. It was a buffer between the West and the Soviet Union, and if there ever was a war between the West and the Soviets would need their industrial capacity, basically. So they couldn't risk the loss of Czechoslovakia because they feared the domino effect for other Eastern Bloc nations moving away from the Soviet Union, hence the invasion force.
Let this be a lesson to our listeners. If they ever hear a politician today use the word domino effect when describing world politics, that's a very, very bad thing and a red flag, because the U.S. also used that as their justification for Vietnam and Iraq and everything.
Yeah.
So be wary of that word when you hear it come up in politics, domino effect.
It's an important one to look out for. Absolutely. You see it, especially when you're looking at the history of the Cold War all the time. That's kind of all background to the events that kind of simmered for another 20 years or so until the late 1980s, kind of the end of the Soviet era. Protests broke out in 1989 after some students basically went on an anti-communist march. They started shouting anti-communist slogans. It was dispersed by the police, and a rumor got started that a student called Martin Schmid was killed as part of police action. Now, this wasn't true, as it turns out. Okay. This was a rumor that was started by a woman called Drahomira Drashka. Please, I'm going to butcher so many pronunciations in this episode. Drashka, she was injured during the riots, and it took ages to get medical care, basically. And so she kind of said that this guy called Martin Schmid was killed by the police. And then she told a bunch of people, including her friend, who was married to a guy called Peter Earl, who worked for Radio Free Liberty.
Oh, you've mentioned this radio station before on this podcast.
So Radio Free Liberty was very popular in Czechoslovakia, and it is essentially an American propaganda arm. But they play cool music, and they promote basically positive free market ideas. But it genuinely was funded by the CIA, certainly in the 1960s, and then a more sort of arm's length body after that. But even if you go on Wikipedia, it is listed under American propaganda organizations.
So it'd be like, that was Jimi Hendrix, and by the way, trickle down, man.
I mean, I think it's a little bit more subtle than that.
Yeah.
For example, saying that a student was killed in protests when maybe they weren't, but yes, that kind of thing. But actually, I wanted at this point to ask you how this sort of affects the events that transpired. I was remembering a conversation we had off air about the Nepalese protests, which may have also been boosted by Radio Free Liberty.
I personally do not believe that liberation is undermined by outside forces that might fund it. I kind of view Tibet in this way, in that, the Dalai Lama is pretty much a CIA op, but that does not diminish the desire of Tibetans to have their culture preserved and autonomy. And likewise, these other movements around the world where people are calling for liberation, I don't think actors that come in from the outside should determine how we view the people on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
But that's my take. I think a lot of people disagree with that, especially leftists. But
Yeah. I think yes, I think a lot of people do. I'm not entirely sure where I stand on it, because I do think there is something to be said for very well-resourced oppositions promoting a specific viewpoint. But I also agree with you that, like, the fact that, you gave the example of Tibet, the fact that the Dalai Lama is, as you put it, basically a CIA op. Yeah, no, that doesn't undermine Tibetan desires for sort of national identity and dignity there. Don't really have a conclusion for that one. That's just something I want the listener to.
It's an interesting point, especially
Yeah.
amongst like leftist circles. I think a lot of people would contest my views, and that's fine.
Yeah. Leave a comment if you're going to be nice.
The only time we've gotten flooded with comments is anti-Greta Israelis, which was fun.
Yeah, I remember that. That's fun. So after this initial protest movements built throughout Prague and indeed throughout Czechoslovakia. And do you know, or can you think, who the first industry to go on strike was?
My initial thought is something to do with transportation, like rail. They're usually on the front lines, or shipping. Though Czechoslovakia does not have a coast, so. But I can assume either railway workers or educators.
Yeah, solid guess, because you're right. We do associate strikes with these very like industrial processes, particularly around rail and stuff like that, because I think they are the perfect thing to disrupt, right? Like if the train's not coming, everyone knows about it.
Yeah.
And with educators, close. So students walked out first.
Oh, always.
But I know, but do they count as an industry? Maybe. They're definitely an active political force. But the first like profession to go on strike in solidarity with them were actors, theatre actors.
Okay.
And that's in part because the students leading the protest were students at the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague. And a lot of their inspiration came from a illicit pamphlet that had been going around called Charter 77, which criticized the Czechoslovak government and talked about specifically the freedom of expression and the freedom of artwork. There was a playwright called Havel who was instrumental in the promoting of this document, Charter 77, and so the actors got on board there.
Okay.
So that started on the 17th of November. More and more groups go on to join this. Theatres all throughout the country join. These protesters form a group called the Civic Forum. And then the Civic Forum, through distributing pamphlets, through the arts and all that, promoted this idea of a general strike. But because this guy who backed the Civic Forum and Charter 77, Václav Havel, he was a known playwright, he got featured on TV promoting this general strike. And when he went on TV and radio and promoted this strike, the TV and radio companies, the state TV and radio companies, also decided to go on strike.
Okay.
So they could use that platform they had to then promote that throughout the whole of the country.
So instead of broadcasting specific things, they were broadcasting information about the strike, or did they just go off air?
They kind of in between that. They weren't like, they did some, the strike was in a few days. So this was starting around like the 20th of November, and the strike was called for the 27th of November. And so they were like promoting it whilst doing their regular programming, saying we're going to stop on the 27th of November. Although the strike on the 27th of November was only 2 hours long.
Okay.
General strike from noon to 2 p.m. But this was very disruptive to the government. The government of Moilaos Jakas, that he resigned as Secretary General on the 24th of November, and the moderate Urbanek was made general secretary after that. The strike, it was thought that he could be like a moderating force between the potential strike and the communist government, but he lasted 5 days.
Okay.
The strike went ahead on the 27th of November. The country ground to a halt for 2 hours. An estimated 75% of the workforce participated in this strike throughout Czechoslovakia. And on the next day, the 28th of November, Urbanek officially ended the Communist Party's legal monopoly on elections.
Wow.
And then more elections happened after that. Havel was made president, and Czechoslovakia became a mixed and then capitalist economy after that.
Do you think if the Soviets had had the capability, they would have just repeated what they did 20 years prior? Because at this point, the Soviet Union's crumbling, right?
Yeah, I do think that plays into it, right? Like, the Soviets were not able to project power in the same way in 1989 as they were in 1968. Who's to say? I think that's definitely a possibility. Although it is worth noting that there were Soviet troops stationed in Czechoslovakia at the time, and one of the things that Havel did as a success was negotiate their exit. There were 73,000 Soviet troops in Czechoslovakia, and he negotiated their exit from the country.
That's a lot of troops for as small a country as Czechoslovakia was.
Yeah, exactly. So that suggests that, this is a very powerful tool, right? Because presumably the Soviets, even with their waning power, could have mobilized those troops to maintain order for the communists in the country, because there are just a lot of people there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the actual divorce with Slovakia is not really relevant to what happened afterwards, but it is just kind of funny, so I'll tell you, and,
sure.
and maybe we'll cut it. So elections started properly in 1990. Various government parties were introduced. 40% of them were like brand new parties and outside of the communist model and all of that. And Slovak nationalism kind of surged up as a result of this. And in the 1992 elections, there was a coalition government between a Czech guy called Klaus and a Slovak guy called Meziar, and they kind of couldn't decide on what Czechoslovakia should look like. And Meziar was pushing for these like really heavy concessions for an independent Slovakia. Like, he wanted Slovakia to have its own currency within Czechoslovakia, and just wouldn't agree to any more moderate positions. And the rest of his party like really didn't care whether Slovakia was independent or not. And the average Slovakian also didn't care whether Slovakia was independent or not. And Czechs also kind of couldn't be bothered if the Slovaks were to leave, because like Czechia was the richer part of Czechoslovakia. And so in the end, no one really cared except Meziar, and so it became independent.
He really didn't like those guys with the weird accents who weren't Catholic.
Yeah, exactly.
At the expense of the economy as well.
Yeah, right.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there we have a pretty convoluted story for a general strike in Czechoslovakia that ultimately led to a total regime change there. And I'm wondering if you can sum up for me what's happened here in Czechia.
You have the traditional government of the Communist Party that had been previously propped up by the Eastern Bloc. You have a monopoly on elections, and a lot of people not being okay with that. So you have the students first, then you have the actors second, you have all these other industries joining in, you have a giant strike. Only 2 hours, you said, right?
Yeah, only 2 hours.
So then the government installed their moderate guy who did not last, and then they had to concede to elections after that. Did I get that right?
Yeah, exactly. But I also wanted to mention how the strike started with students and actors and went on to the media corporations after that as a way of promoting it. I forgot to mention before, but the TV and broadcasters also got newspaper editors on board with it as well. So it was promoted through the newspapers as well as TV and radio and actors.
And this was a big way the Hong Kong protests when I was there were promoted. There were a lot of stations and newspapers that were state-controlled, but there were a few, such as Apple Daily and the Free Press, that were independent, and they were really used to spread the word, essentially. I don't know how it was on radio and TV because I don't speak Cantonese. But those newspapers did have English sections. So,
well, see, that's super interesting, and I want to bear all of this in mind as we go on to the next strike that I want to talk about. I want to fast forward about 30 years, slightly more than 30 years, to talk about India's 2020 strike, or the protest action that took place between 2020 and 2021, but the strike was in 2020. Do you remember this?
Well, I know that Hong Kongers love to claim every protest that happened late 2019 for the next year or two as being inspired by them. And there's some
really?
There's some truth to some of them, and especially in the strategies, but some of them they're reaching a bit. But I to be honest, I don't remember these Indian strikes super well because there are a lot of strikes in South Asia lately.
Yeah, that's true.
So can you remind me?
For sure. So these were in response to the farm bills, the quote-unquote farm bills.
I do remember some fuss about farmers, and I remember the numbers being very staggering.
Yeah. So this was a proposed law by the Modi government to basically liberalize, quote-unquote, agricultural policies. In India, there is effectively like minimum pricing for agricultural goods, and the government agrees to buy agricultural goods at a certain minimum price, right? And this is important because 50% of the workforce in India works in agriculture. So a lot of people depend on this money. Now, the Modi government was trying to say that this would make it easier for farmers to sell to big corporations, these reforms. And it would have done that from the perspective of the big corporations. It would have made it easier for big corporations to really lowball smallholder farmers on the price of their goods. Basically.
Also, how is that a selling point to the people? Like, hey, you see how broken America and the UK are with like how the big companies own everything? Like, let's do that too, guys.
Yeah, it was unpopular. It was an unpopular law. And in response, huge numbers of people protested. A 24-hour strike was called, on which it was reported that as many as 250 million people participated.
Wow.
Now, I have seen that figure contested on a news outlet called Alt News, which does appear to be a legitimate organization despite the name, but they just said this seems fishy. They didn't really. They were like, this tweet said 250 million, but the photo isn't from this. But I don't know. The BBC reported it as 250 million, so I figure it was a lot of people regardless. There were like 5 districts in India where general strikes happened, and Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh reported 100% strike rates in those states. Yeah. Work stopped in banks, government services, transport, power stations, post offices, really all across the country.
Were the government workers themselves participating?
Some of them, yeah.
So what was the response? Was there a crackdown on that behavior? Because I know that can be retaliated against sometimes.
There was, but this was supported by like 16 trade unions and 10 political parties. So, like, the members of those political parties were protected by their party to a degree.
Yeah.
Same with the trade unions, especially because a lot of the labor rights in India go back to the overthrow, withdrawal, the ending of the British rule in India, and so like labor rights are equated with nationalism to a degree in India. As far as I'm aware, I look forward to being corrected if I've misunderstood that. But the big thing that coincided with the strike was what they did with it, which is when farmers like marched on Delhi. And
I remember this.
Yeah, we've seen this so often recently. Farmers just like driving tractors into cities, and they basically blocked 7,000 tractors in Delhi on that day, and they blocked basically every exit and entry to Delhi and just completely shut the city down. So is that a strike? Is it a protest? It's kind of, I mean, there's a lot of overlap, and this is really the most overlap that I can think of. And ultimately, that law was repealed. It took a little while; it took several months, but it was repealed. There's also some reports that social media was active in promoting support for the movement because of viral videos of the paramilitary police force attacking old people, especially an elderly Sikh man. There were also strikes this July in 2025, which I haven't included here because the results aren't clear yet. And also they were less specific. They were just against sort of neoliberal reforms in general. I think that this strike had a very specific aim, which was to stop these farm bills. They had other aims as well, around installing minimum prices and pensions and all of that. But the big success was striking down these farm bills.
Well, it's easier to achieve a victory for your cause if you do have a clear end goal and something you bring to the table for it to stop, because that's what the government wants, is they want you to stop doing this thing. So they're like, okay, what do you want?
Yeah. So I think that's important. And I think that happened to a degree with the Velvet Revolution as well, right? Like, it was about removing censorship. And actually, the protest was also about removing the one-party mandate in Czechoslovakia.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that... So obviously, these are quite different protests, the general strike in India and the general strike in Czechoslovakia. Do you think that they're so different that it doesn't really make sense to compare them? Do you think we can still draw these as analog processes, even though the contexts around them are so different?
No, I think they work as a formula in a way. I think you have to analyze how the word got out, how different parties came to agree to do this strike, and you have to look at the results. So I think they are really similar in that regard. I don't think the nation itself matters too much, or the amount of people, because as we know, Czechoslovakia compared to India is very tiny. But
population Czechoslovakia 1989. It was about 15.7 million people, as opposed to India, which in 2020 had a population of 1.4 billion. So approximately, what is that, 100 times more people in India?
You said 250 million people participated in the protests.
I did,
so that's however many times more than the entire Czech population.
Yeah, it's true, yeah.
Czechoslovak population.
So maybe numbers don't matter so much in...
But yeah, I do think that there is a synchronicity to these methods. I think that's kind of the point of this podcast in a way, is to analyze very different situations and pull out formulas and tactics and see where things can line up. That's why I bring Hong Kong into everything when we talk about it, because that's the protest I saw with my own eyes. But I do find relevance when I bring it up. It's not just to bring it up for no reason.
Yeah, for sure. And I think an episode that I want to do in the not too distant future is actually really diving into not just the history of it, but maybe the specific techniques of one of these, which I did look out for this episode. It is surprisingly hard to find. You need to really, I think, delve into some very specific academic books. But I now have JSTOR access again, so that's...
All you need to do is ask before. But I think, what I know from a lot of the contemporary protests, I see from social media, right? I see it with my own eyes. I can see protesters doing these things. So I can imagine that when you're studying it from the 20th century, it becomes really unclear what was actually happening on the ground, because the governments themselves did not want to promote that. So you really need a lot of oral history, eyewitness accounts, which were actively trying to be suppressed. So
for sure. And actually, talking about social media, that brings us to the most recent strike action that we spoke about back at the beginning, which is the Italian general strike of September 2025. Now, this is ongoing, right? And did you see the speech from the dock worker in Genoa who spoke about this?
And I think you should give some context, because to our listeners that are in America, as I've mentioned before, we don't get any news from around the world right now, because there is so much turmoil here. Yeah.
So there is currently ongoing a flotilla, the Sumud Flotilla, which is carrying humanitarian aid to Gaza. Israel has been blocking access of aid to Gaza, and so ordinary citizens have taken it upon themselves to sail to Gaza and deliver aid. This has happened various times before. In the summer, at the beginning of the summer, we actually did an episode where we talked about Greta Thunberg and Liam Cunningham, who played Sir Davos from Game of Thrones, who sailed in a boat to Gaza and were apprehended by the IDF and were sent back to Europe. And basically, the only reason that they weren't killed was because they were celebrities.
Episode 4, by the way, of our podcast. And it's crazy that it's months later and
Yeah.
there have not been any positive developments until this point.
Not from delivering the aid, that's absolutely true. But the flotilla is hopeful because the hypothesis went that if they launched a really big flotilla, then Israel wouldn't have the same goal to attack them, stop them in international waters. That doesn't appear to have been true, at least so far, as they remain pretty brazen. Drone attacks have been attacking the flotilla. But in response to that, some of the ships left from the Italian port of Genoa. Some left from Barcelona, some more left from Tunis. And when the boats left Genoa on the 30th of August, a dock worker who was a representative of the Unione Sindacale di Base, which is a syndicate of unions, said that the unions would shut down Europe if they lost contact with the flotilla for even 20 minutes. Mm. I looked at like 4 different news articles and none of them actually reported the name of this guy. They just said a dock worker representing the union.
I mean, he might have not wanted his name out there, you know.
Yeah, I think that might be the case. I've also seen the video of him doing that. It's quite an inspiring speech. Italian's a good language for an impassioned speech.
Mm-hmm. Bella ciao.
Yeah, bella ciao indeed. And speaking of bella ciao, given that Israel did attack the flotilla, which are currently off the coast of Greece in international waters, protests erupted all over Italy. They started kind of on September 19th. There were perhaps as many as 1 million protesters throughout Italy over the course of these protests. Roads and trains were blocked. The port of Genoa was blocked. All weapons shipments to Israel were named as part of that. Dock workers in Genoa went on strike, and dock workers in Trieste, Venice, and Livorno also joined the strike in solidarity.
I knew Livorno would be in there. They're like super communist.
Yeah. Livorno's. I spent like 12 hours there once. It's an incredible place. Now, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who is of the far right, called the protesters hooligans. However, the Defense Minister Guido Crosetto, noting the strike action and noting the drone attacks on the flotilla on the 24th of September, 2 days ago, approved the dispatch of a warship to accompany the flotilla.
This was something I did see on the news, and I was surprised by because, as you said, Italy currently is being ruled by a far-right regime.
Yeah.
So it just kind of reflects how successful these strikes have been in that this government, which is very presumably pro-Israel. I don't know a lot about Italy's
super pro-Israel. They still refuse to recognize the Palestinian state, joining an increasingly dwindling number of countries. Even Britain and France, in what was rather a hollow gesture, have agreed to recognize the Palestinian state, but Meloni is still very anti that.
If you're left holding the bag with the United States, you're in bad company, my friend. But yeah, I mean, I guess that just reflects, again, the effectiveness of striking, because you have a Zionist right-wing regime sending aid to the flotilla and basically a military escort, right?
Well, now this is interesting because, yes and no, it is a military escort. However, what's really interesting is the knock-on effect of this, because Crosetto has clarified that the warship that is accompanying these ships doesn't have any escort duty. It seems like the official line is that it's just kind of going the same way as them.
Okay.
And the expectation is that it acts as a deterrent. However, as a result of the Italian Navy sending a warship, the government of Spain, led by pro-Palestinian Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, authorized 2 Spanish warships to accompany the flotilla, and they do have an escort duty. So they have a duty to protect Spanish citizens. They have a deal with the government of Belgium to protect Belgian citizens on the flotilla, and they're currently negotiating with the Irish government to do the same thing for Irish citizens on board these ships.
Some Habsburg connections there with the Belgians.
I hadn't even thought of that, but yeah, I guess so.
Pretty common Spain W right now. They've been...
Yeah, Spain's doing so good right now. It's crazy. So Spain, so that is a knock-on effect of industrial action in Italy, giving or seemingly giving Spain a license to issue even more substantive support than the Italians were. There is an international component to all of this.
Maybe I missed this, but did Spain pledge escort all the way to Gaza?
That's a great question, and I don't know.
I mean, this is
don't think
ongoing,
so.
and by the time this comes out, it'll be about 9 days from now. So
Yeah.
I think Adam will have an update for us.
Yes, I will put an update at the end of this episode, which I'll record after the fact. So we'll keep you updated with what's gone on there. The only reason I would question that is that Meloni's official line is that she wants the flotilla to basically drop off aid in Cyprus and hand it over to the Patriarch of Jerusalem to issue this aid, and the flotilla's like, no, basically. Well, there's currently a meeting going on in Italy with European trade unions around dock work. This is happening starting today and going on over the course of the weekend. Representatives from Marseille and Athens and Barcelona are all going to Italy to talk specifically about solidarity in the case of this flotilla. So we may see more strike action throughout Europe.
I mean, these dock cities, like these dock cities in Europe, notoriously have like on the Mediterranean, have a higher percentage of North African populations than other parts of those countries. So I don't think it's a huge surprise that presumably a lot of them have become dock workers themselves after living in places like Marseille. That there is sympathy for the people of Palestine, even more so than would exist throughout the country, as well as people just being of the working class generally in those types of cities.
Yeah, exactly. They are pretty working class cities, and also I think that dock workers remain an industry where unionization is pretty present and easier to organize according to unions, just based on the structure of the labor that exists there.
Yeah.
So it remains to be seen what happens with the flotilla and if more strike action will emerge. As we say, I'll give an update for you there. There's going to be a national demonstration happening in Rome on the 4th of October, and it's looking like there are going to be some pretty big protests in Udine on the 14th of October ahead of a football match when Israel will be playing Italy in a qualifying match for the World Cup.
I mean, the fact that Israel is still in UEFA and the fact that they're still in like Eurovision and all of this stuff, I mean, I think it's reaching its breaking point. I think there's like 6 or 7 European countries that swore they wouldn't participate in Eurovision next year if Israel's there. But maybe that'll be an episode for another day once we find out what happens with that.
Yeah, for sure.
But it does seem like a lot of the structures within Europe have withstood the pressure for the last 2 years, but are reaching their breaking points. And side note, Mussolini himself made it a bit easier to protest in Rome after he paved over half of the Forum to build that highway so you could get a picture of him riding to his palace with the Colosseum behind him.
Right.
Leave some wide avenues for some protesters.
Leave some wide avenues, exactly. So I should also say that it's like not clear that Italy sent the ship because of the strike. But come on.
Come on.
Come on.
Yeah, they just felt like taking a little...
yeah, the timing's a little too suspicious.
They just heard the weather is really nice around Cyprus this time of year.
Hey, this is Adam with the update. As you've probably seen, the flotilla was indeed intercepted. Following our recording on the 27th of September, Turkish frigates also began escorting the flotilla, and this was really hopeful. Unfortunately, on the 30th of September, the Italian Navy announced it would cease its escort of the flotilla once it reached 150 nautical miles, or around 280 kilometers, off the coast of Gaza. The Turkish government made some vague commitments about escorting the flotilla if needed, and the Spanish government announced that its escort would cease 120 nautical miles, or 280 kilometers, off the coast of Gaza. The reasons for this aren't explicitly clear. The best explanation that I saw came from a news organization called Barely Informed, which pointed out that the announcement of the cessation of escort duties coincided with the American peace plan for Gaza, which stipulated that aid would be released into Gaza following the release of the remaining hostages held by Hamas. It's thought that the arrival of aid prior to this could have been perceived as endangering this process, and so the governments of Turkey, Italy, and Spain may have been under enormous pressure from Washington to cease their escorts. On the 1st of October, the flotilla was intercepted. And those sailing to Gaza were taken hostage or prisoner by the Israeli Navy. Activist Greta Thunberg was reportedly beaten and forced to kiss the Israeli flag, to name just one instance of the horrific conditions that the Sumud Flotilla activists were subjected to. 341 activists have been deported from Israel to Europe, while 138 remain in custody in Israel. Speaking upon her arrival in Greece, Greta Thunberg admirably pointed out that whilst she could talk about the abuses that she suffered, this is a distraction from the real story, which is the genocide in Gaza. Since then, massive protests have been underway throughout Europe, including a reported 2 million people protesting in Italy. There's been some condemnation from the international community, notably with Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, expelling all Israeli diplomats from the country as a result of the interception. What happens next remains to be seen. This is a disappointing but not unexpected outcome, but we encourage comrades not to lose hope, as this can only benefit the oppressor. We encourage you to protest where you can, and we are eager to see what organising takes place next. So, what do you think these have in common, and what do you think are some lessons that we can pull out as we reach the end of the episode here?
I mean, the commonality, and maybe we can analyze this later on about strikes that did not work. But it seems like the commonality is that strikes are super effective compared to other forms of protest. And the lesson learned is that maybe there should be more strikes.
Yeah, so I think that's true. But I also think what you said at the top about them being hard to organize is really true. And something that I noticed in relation to all of these is that they're all issues that really tug at people on an emotional level, right? In Czechoslovakia, I don't think it's a coincidence that it was playwrights who are really involved leading this and actors, because they have this like connection with art and the soul of the place. Like the movement that led to the Prague Spring was called Socialism with a Human Face, right? It's really about emotion, about soul. In India, agriculture is like 50% of the nation work in agriculture.
Well, and to jump on that, sorry to interrupt, but there was a speech that I believe it was Nehru gave called Technology with a Human Face. And it was basically to settle this debate that he had with Gandhi on a pragmatic level of how should India be organized. Because Gandhi wanted these little villages that were self-sustaining, and Nehru said we have to industrialize to compete. But when we industrialize, we should not forget the average farmer. We should not forget what makes India India. So there's a connection to the Czech one as well. Interesting.
Yeah, and so that's interesting plays in there. This humanization element is perhaps something that we can draw out, right? Like that strike actions that have raised this massive support have really appealed to people's humanity. And I mean, Lord knows that's happened with Gaza, right? We've all been watching the inhumanity for 2 years on our smartphones, on Instagram. And I think that's part of why it was effective, because people are so impassioned by the injustice of it all.
Yeah, I agree completely. I couldn't agree more with you on that.
Yeah, remember kids, art is important. Art and sport, very important things.
As Pope John Paul II would say, of all of life's unimportant things, football is the most important.
And I would wholeheartedly agree with that. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up here, Sam?
I think in our day-to-day, when we feel hopeless, we can look at these types of movements and see that the average person was able to make a direct impact through their actions. Our world is set up to where the most important part of us to our governments is our labor. So don't be afraid to organize and wield it against them if the need arises.
Wholeheartedly agree. And a good place to leave it. Thank you for listening, dear listener. Thank you for podding with me, Sam. Make sure you look out for each other, stay safe, and keep fighting the good fight. To take us away, I have a quote for you to read for us, Sam. It's from the world of sport, but I think it is applicable to us here. So if you could take us home with this quote from American baseball legend Babe Ruth.
I see what you did here. Every strike brings me closer to the next home run.